Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today is part 1 of our European coffee roaster tier list. In celebration of hitting the 1,000 subscriber milestone, we're going to be ranking 25 European coffee roasters on a tier list scale, with today's video featuring coffee roasters 1 through 12, tomorrow's video featuring coffee roasters 13 through 25. All of these coffee roasters are sorted alphabetically, so let's go over the parameters that are required in order to make it into this list. All these are also coffee roasters that we've reviewed on this channel, and each must meet one of 2 minimum requirements in order to make it onto this list. The first of which is that we must have at least 2 full bag reviews from this coffee roaster. The second is that we must have at least 4 Cafe Box Advent Calendar samples, as there are a number of coffee roasters on this list, in which we've had multiple samples. Let's go over the tiers real quick, as they're unchanged from our previous coffee roaster tier list. And at the very top, we have the World Class category. And this category is reserved for coffee roasters that I find to be very innovative, transcendent, and serving me some of my favorite coffees in the entire world. Next up, we have the Amazing category. And this category is reserved for coffee roasters that I feel have world-class potential. They might be some coffee roasters that I don't have as much familiarity with, but coffee roasters that I have had a number of coffees that I've really enjoyed. Next up, we have the Great category. And the Great category is reserved for coffee roasters in which I've had probably more coffees from them that I've enjoyed than coffees that I haven't enjoyed. Maybe some coffee roasters that I also don't have as much familiarity with, but have served me some coffees that have been on the better end of things. Next up, we have the Good category, and the Good category is for coffee roasters that I might have kind of lukewarm experiences on in general. Also some coffee roasters I don't have as much experience with, but for the most part, coffee roasters I don't deem to be as good as the ones in the Great category. Next up, we have the OK category, and the OK category is for coffee roasters that might not necessarily be ones that are my type of coffee. I would say coffee roasters that the majority of the coffees I've had from them have been ones that I've enjoyed a little less than coffees I've enjoyed. Last up, we have the Not My Cup category, which was also in our previous tier list, and the Not My Cup category is reserved for coffee roasters that may not necessarily have my sort of roast profile or my sort of processing method style, as they tend to skew a little bit more on the experimental side of things. A little bit of a giveaway on that one, but as I said in the previous tier list as well, none of these are bad coffee roasters by any means. This is very much a subjective list from my preferences. So let's go ahead and dive right into this list. And the first coffee roaster we will be discussing here today is April, and they're based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And this is a coffee roaster I do have pretty limited familiarity with, as we've done 3 bag reviews of their coffee. 1 natural processed Costa Rica, a wash processed Ethiopia, and a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And none of those 3 coffees necessarily wowed me, as the Kenyan coffee came out very Kenyan-like. The Ethiopian coffee came out a little bit more citric than I was expecting, and I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the natural processed Costa Rican coffee, which typically isn't my type of coffee to begin with. With that being said, I do have some really positive things to say about this coffee roaster, as I am a huge fan of their April brewer. It's actually one of my favorite brew methods, and if I could get my hands on more of their filters, I'd probably use it just as regularly as I use the V60 or the Chemex. So it's a brew method that I very much enjoy. They're not necessarily the coffee roaster I would say is my favorite on this tier list, mostly because I don't have too much experience with them, and I wasn't necessarily overly impressed by the coffees I have had from them up to this point. So for right now, I'm going to put them in the Good category, but that is definitely subject to change. If you are a fan of April, then I do have something from their high-end offerings that we're going to be reviewing soon. And I definitely do want to review more of their coffees here in the future, as I feel like maybe tinkering with it a little bit more, I could get some more out of their coffee. Next up, we have Calendar, which is based out of Galway, Ireland. And when I was doing my research for this video, I realized that we have actually only ever reviewed washed Central and South American coffees from Calendar, which is kind of interesting to me because I assumed that maybe I'd reviewed more, but for that reason, I haven't reviewed any of their honey, their natural, or even any of their African coffees. So it's kind of interesting that I do have a limited sample size of them, but I do have 3 full bag washed Ecuadorian reviews and a washed Guatemalan review. And what I have to say about this coffee roaster is that they have a pretty high floor, and they have a somewhat low ceiling, as their coffees tend to come out a little bit more on the tame side of things for me. With that being said, they do roast my type of roast profile, as well as my style of coffees as well, focusing heavily on the more wash processed coffees in general. So for that reason, they have had a lot more coffees that I have enjoyed, even if certain times I have felt that they were slightly underwhelming. So for right now, I'm going to go ahead and put them in the great category. Definitely enjoyed the vast majority of the coffees I have had from them up to this point. Definitely want to review some of their African as well as some of their natural and honey processed coffees in the future, limited as they may be. Next up, we have Kapha Circular, and Kapha Circular based out of Arendal, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that we feature a lot on this channel, and people know I have so many positive things to say about them, so I'm going to start with the few negatives that I do have. And my first impression of them wasn't necessarily the best first impression, as the first time I tried them was during our first ever Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. And to be fair, it was two coffees that weren't necessarily my style of coffee to begin with, and I thought that they were quite well done and they were very flavorful coffees, but they weren't necessarily my type of coffee to begin with. In addition to that, if you look at their website, it can be a little bit of information overload and it can be a little difficult to navigate. It's not necessarily the cleanest website, and those are kind of the only two knocks I have on them, and I had to kind of preface all the good with some sort of negative, as truth be told, I do think that they're one of the very best coffee roasters in the entire world, and there are so many reasons for that. They have earned a number of accolades in some of the series that we do on this channel, including our top 10 coffees of the year list, as this past year they had our second favorite coffee from the entirety of 2022. In addition to that, they won our Battle of the Tomato, and they have had a number of coffees that have finished in our top 10 coffees of the year list as well. In addition to that, I do have a lot of interest in their Kenyan separation project. I find it to be one of the most innovative and important projects that any coffee roaster is doing, and it's definitely captivated my attention. In addition to that, their work with Pepe Ihon is something that's very important to me, and I am highly anticipating their next review of it, their next series of coffees from him this year. I have so many positive things to say. I definitely think that they're easily one of the best coffee roasters in the entire world. In my opinion, they're easily one of my favorite as well. So I'm going to put them in the world-class category. I definitely find them to be a very impressive coffee roaster. In fact, my V60 recipe is modeled after them. In addition to that, my water preferences is also modeled after their guide too. I've taken so much influence from this coffee roaster as a whole. All right, next up we have Coffee Collective, based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. I do apologize if I sound a little congested. I've been sick for the last couple of days, but yeah, let's try to get through this tier list. Next up, we have Coffee Collective, and a coffee roaster I do have extensive familiarity with, as I was fortunate enough to do a cupping at the La Marzocco back when La Marzocco still did coffee roaster residencies, and it also afforded me an opportunity to try their soft serve, so that was kind of a cool experience. And I'm in kind of two camps with Coffee Collective, so we'll start out with the negative first, and the negative is that I was a little underwhelmed by their Panamanian geisha that I had this past year. In addition to that, I had somewhat high expectations for their Juan, which was also a slightly disappointing coffee. And I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of some of their Akmel series coffees either. And now the opposite side of that, the positives, because there are quite a few positives as well. Their Takizi geisha is one of my favorite Bolivian coffees. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really impressive geisha in general, so that was one positive, and I've also really enjoyed some of their standard offerings in the past as well. So they do have some really positive things going for them, but I think given that my last couple of experiences with them haven't been as good as what I've remembered from them in the past, for the moment, I'm going to have to put them in the great category. I definitely think that they can get back to something higher on this tier list, and I might need to try some more of their coffees, so hopefully in the future. I saw that they released the Takizi geisha, so maybe I'll get an opportunity to try that one this year as well. All right, next up we have Domateo, which is based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is an interesting coffee roaster because we've had an interesting mix from them. We've had 3 honey processed Costa Ricans and 2 wash processed Kenyan coffees. I do apologize. As mentioned, I am still sick, so I'm going to take a sip of water right here. All right, Domateo. So what's been really interesting about them is the 2 wash processed Kenyan coffees that I have had from them have been very positive experiences, but the most recent one reminded me a lot more of a natural processed Ethiopian coffee than a wash processed Kenyan coffee, which in itself is a little bit more of a positive, as I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of traditional Kenyan coffees. And their Costa Rican coffees have also been nice. So everything that I've had from them, I've enjoyed, which is a positive given that they've been mostly coffees that typically aren't my first choice in general. So for that reason, I'm going to put them in the great category. I really wonder what would happen if I was able to try one of their coffees that was maybe a little bit more suited towards my preferences. All right, next up we have Jakku, which is based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands, and this one's kind of an interesting one because this is probably the coffee roaster I have the most familiarity with, which might be interesting to some people given that we only have 4 reviews of their coffee on this channel, but I've probably tried somewhere north of 30 different coffees of theirs, given that there is a coffee shop that serves them as their drip offering pretty frequently. So I've tried so many of their different coffees, and one theme that I've continued to find is I'm just not necessarily the biggest fan of this coffee roaster, as my favorite coffee from them is probably the Milky Cake. Even then, that's a little bit of an interesting coffee, but the vast majority of their coffees have come out maybe a little bit too bright for me in general, so they haven't necessarily been my favorite coffee roaster, but I keep going back to them because I keep thinking at some point I'm going to kind of figure out what it is, and I'm going to kind of convince myself to like them a little bit more than I do at this point, so definitely not done reviewing them. I think that their marketing is really impressive, and that's been a contributor in me purchasing as many of their coffees as I have. I'm going to put them in the okay category for right now, given that the vast majority of my experiences haven't necessarily been coffees that I've enjoyed. Next up, we have Drop Coffee, which is based out of Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm going to start with the positive on this one. So the biggest positive I have about this coffee roaster is a couple of years ago, their anaerobic washed Bolivian coffee ended up in our top 5 coffees, in our top 10 coffees of the year list, but in the top 5 range of that list, and it was a really impressive coffee, so I had a really high impression of Drop. That being said, since then I haven't necessarily been as impressed in this previous advent calendar, as neither of the 2 coffees were coffees that I was overly enjoying. The carbonic maceration Nicaraguan coffee, I believe, was one of them, but definitely wasn't one that I enjoyed, and the Ethiopian I think I had higher expectations for, so we're kind of in 2 camps on this one. They've served me one of my favorite coffees that we've reviewed on this channel, but at the same time, the majority of the other things I have had haven't necessarily been my favorite. So I think for the time being, I'm just going to put them in the good category. I definitely do want to try more of their coffees in the future. Unfortunately, I haven't seen as many multi-roasters carrying them now as I had in the past. I definitely have my eye out on some of their Bolivian coffees, as they're one of the coffee roasters that offers a little bit more Bolivian coffees than I typically see. All right, next up we have Fathers, which is based out of Ostrava, Czech Republic. And this is a coffee roaster that has featured a little bit more frequently on this channel as of late. And that's because a lot more multi-roasters have started carrying Fathers, and it's been great. I've mentioned going into our first review of them that I do have a little bit of bias given that I am of Czech descent, and it was really exciting to see a Czech coffee roaster gain some notoriety. But in addition to that, I've actually really enjoyed all 3 of the coffees that we've reviewed from them up to this point, but the best is actually still yet to come, and I do want to preface this tier list with that because we do have a review from them coming out here in the near future, which was by far the best coffee that I've ever had from them, and given that all of my experiences up to that point had been really positive, I definitely do see them having world-class potential. So for that reason, I'm going to put them in the amazing category. I definitely want to try more of their coffees in the future. They do have some kind of interesting coffees that I've steered clear of, but even then, I do think that there is so much potential within this coffee roaster, and I'm very much hoping to try a lot more of their offerings here in the future. If they do have high-end offerings, I haven't seen one yet. I definitely want to get my hands on one of those. All right, next up we have fried hats, and to quote one of my good friends, people love fried hats, and that's actually kind of true. Their bottles are one of the most unique packaging that any coffee roaster in the world has, and I actually have a fair bit of experience with them. We've reviewed a number of their coffees on this channel because people really enjoy our fried hats reviews, and we've had 4 different washed coffees. Let's see if I can rattle them off: Ethiopia, Guatemala, Colombia, and Peru, I believe. We've also had a couple of naturals, and I haven't been as big a fan of their natural processed coffees as I have of their washed coffees. And the kind of takeaway I've had from their washed coffees is that they also do have a little bit of a low ceiling, as they're not necessarily the most vibrant or flavorful coffees, but they do a very nice job in general, as they're also somewhat of safe coffees. I do enjoy them significantly more than I don't, so for that reason I'm going to go ahead and put them in the great category. I think that they're doing a very nice job. All right, next up we have Fruit, based out of Turku, Finland. And this is another coffee roaster that we have limited familiarity with, but it's a very interesting coffee roaster that I could say a lot about, as we have 2 reviews of them, one of which was a Honduran coffee and the other of which was an Ethiopian coffee. And the Ethiopian coffee, which was our first review, was one that I wasn't overly impressed by when I was reviewing it, but I went back a couple of weeks after the review and I brewed it one more time, and I was really impressed by that coffee 2 weeks after the time that review had been posted. So I wanted to go back and try another one of their coffees, and while I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the Honduras, I heard so many positive things from so many other people that were saying it was one of their favorite coffees of the entire year. And I saw what it was going for, even if it was a little bit of a tricky coffee at times. So for the most part, their coffees have exceeded my expectations, but it's taken a little bit more time. So I think that they might be a little bit more tricky of a coffee roaster, but I do have my eye on them. I'm hoping that there might be some more multi-roasters that start carrying them here in the future, because they're an interesting coffee roaster to say the least. I'm going to go ahead and put them in the great category. All right, 2 more coffee roasters. So let's see if I can survive getting through those 2. All right, next up we have Jakku, which is based out of, looking at my notes here, Alsund, Norway. And Jakku's an interesting coffee roaster for a number of reasons. So the majority of which we've tried from them have been experimental processed coffees. But then the other side of that one has been a Panamanian geisha, which I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, and given Panamanian geishas are my favorite coffee, that was a little unfortunate because that was kind of the only metrics I had to gauge them by. In addition to that, though, there is one more coffee that we have tried from them, and it was their Key, which was their wash-processed Kenyan coffee, and that turned out to be one of my favorite coffees from the entirety of the previous Advent calendar. So what I'm really hoping from them is that I might get an opportunity to try more of their washed coffees, because the one standard washed coffee I have had from them I really enjoyed, but everything else was either typically not something I would go for or something that was very much my style, but I was a little underwhelmed by. So kind of puts them in a tricky place. And to kind of balance it out, I think had it not been for maybe that Key, I would put them in the not my cup, but I'm going to put them in the okay category for right now. If it was just based off of that Key, I could go all the way as high as the great category. It was a really nice coffee, but I think for right now, that's kind of the safe choice until maybe I try more of their standard washed coffees, and I would kind of hope that I might get some more of those in the future. All right, last one for this video, and we're going to be discussing Kapha, which is based out of Oslo, Norway. And this coffee roaster, we've done 2 full bag reviews of. I think that they were both released at the start of this year. Yeah, they were. And what inspired me to want to try them again is that their Buku Saisa won our Cafe Box Advent Calendar Blind Taste Test series from a couple of years ago, as it kind of came out of nowhere. I had no familiarity with the coffee roaster. I'd never even heard of the coffee roaster before trying that coffee, and I was just so impressed by it. One of my favorite natural processed Ethiopian coffees that we have ever reviewed on this channel. But then to follow that up, I was also really impressed by the other coffee that was featured in that Advent calendar, and then also the 2 coffees that we have reviewed from them this year. They are definitely dark horses to finish on our top 10 coffees of the year list. So as of this moment, all 4 coffees that I've had from them have been way above expectation. They have been coffees that I have enjoyed thoroughly. I think the main reason for that is it feels slightly nostalgic to me. The coffees remind me of a lot of Sweet Bloom's coffees from the past. They're very sweet, they're very sugary coffees, and they do have a little bit more development than I think I would expect for a Scandinavian coffee roaster, but I really don't mind that given just the way the coffees do turn out. For that reason, maybe until I do try one of their higher end offerings, I think they're doing a really impressive job. They are one of my favorite coffee roasters on this tier list, and if their coffee was maybe a little bit more easily accessible, I would probably try them a lot more. I saw that they had a Hacienda La Esmeralda washed Panamanian geisha a couple of years ago that I missed out on that I very much wanted. I'm going to put them in the amazing category. I do think that they have world-class potential. I would love to try some of their higher-end offerings, and given the extremely positive experiences I've had with them to this point, I feel like they belong in that category for now. All right, this is part 1, so I would love to hear your guys' feedback on this tier list as well. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Do you have any predictions for where some of these coffee roasters might finish for tomorrow? I would love to hear from you guys on this one, but I'm going to leave this part at that. If you guys are enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been part 1 of our European coffee roaster tier list. Thank you for watching.